Hey guys, welcome back to World of Warships. Today we're taking a look at Hawaii, maybe the craziest ship they're releasing this update. You get light cruiser DPM on a battle cruiser hull. So if you've ever found that battleships cross-mapping you, everything kills your light cruiser incredibly quickly, well, worry no longer. You just get Alaska survivability while retaining light cruiser DPM and utility. Absolutely absurd. This ship gets 324,000 HE DPM, a little worse than things like Smolensk at 384,000 HE DPM. However, we get an F key, and this F key is going to buff our reload rate by 43%. Yeah, it's going to cut our reload down by 43%. Absolutely absurd, getting us close to Colbert DPM with the F key activated. Wild. And as a reminder, it's still an Alaska hull, so we have normal Alaska armor, which is quite strong. Can be overmatched at tier 10, certainly, but it's 74k HP with 4 heals. Let me remind you that something like Colbert gets only 36,000 HP. Something like Smolensk gets 32,000 HP. Way worse armor as well. Crazy. This ship also gets a radar as well. 8.5 kilometer range, so no 10 kilometer range radar here. It's a little bit of a downside there, but most light cruisers like this aren't getting radars. Certainly not the ones with such high DPM. This ship gets great shell velocity as well, by the way, especially without the F key used. 18.3 kilometers of range with Smolensk shell arcs, so faster shells yet than Colbert. That is in our lower DPM mode, though. In high DPM mode, it's like Atlanta shell velocity. So very, very slow. You get like 12.2 kilometers of range in that. And it's very hard to hit things at 12 kilometers with Atlanta shell velocity. So for the most part, I actually found myself sticking in the normal firing mode because it's just so comfortable to lead these shells with this shell velocity here. A lot of the time we talk about DPM, but let's be honest, it's more important to have hitting DPM. Actually being able to lead and hit your target is much more important. So I found myself a lot of the time, especially into destroyers, loving the extra shell velocity. But that flexibility is really, really nice. There's plenty of opportunities where you want the more DPM and you're fine with giving up some shell velocity because it's really close range, or maybe it's a big target like a battleship at closer ranges too. So really good flexibility there. Wild that we can pick between bad shell velocity and essentially Colbert DPM, a little bit worse, or take worse DPM by a bit than Smolensk, but have its shell velocity. And by the way, 18.3 kilometers of range is not with range mod. That is reload mod. You could run range mod on this yet. I wouldn't recommend it because the DPM is so addicting, but absolutely crazy ship. I will say, though, the superstructure is a little bit bigger than Alaska, so it's not quite the same level of armor on this ship, but the hull is the same, and more importantly, the citadel. It's that below-water citadel that is very hard to hit on Alaska. Things like Colbert and Smolensk, very large above-water citadels. Smolensk in particular, very skinny ship, so often just eats overpens, but this ship also just eats overpens because the citadel is so low in the water. At 74k HP to get through, mind you. That is so much. And I gotta say, I'm a little surprised this one didn't get some nerfs. We looked at Roussillon yesterday, and that one is still a good ship, but got kind of nerfed in testing. And Bremen and Hawaii got buffs during its testing, or at least Hawaii didn't get nerfed down in testing, which is kind of wild to me. Usually the downside of having such high DPM in this game is that your ship is very, very fragile, right? There's got to be trade-offs, right, Wargaming? We need trade-offs for strengths and weaknesses in a ship, right? Oh my goodness, with Hawaii, it does not feel like that. The DPM just absolutely pours in. I should mention, though, this F key does have a few more weaknesses just than shell velocity. So we already talked about range, but you do have worse fire chance. So it cuts your fire chance by 4%. And it also cuts your AP shell damage by 12%. So the AP, it does not quite get the absurd DPM. It's still very good. You get up to 666,000 AP DPM with this activated. Normally the AP DPM is 432,000, so it is still worth using. But with those slow arcs, AP also loses some pen. So keep that in mind. You might find yourself shattering a little bit more. With this F key active, the HE DPM goes to 571,000 HE DPM, if I didn't mention that already. Remember, Colbert's 592. So very, very close to that Colbert level of DPM, which is absolutely absurd to me that we can get that. Maybe I'm repeating myself too much, but this ship seems kind of ridiculous. For steel, though, we got to remember, steel will event, 39,000 steel. There is an opportunity to use a 15% discount on it. We only get one of those for this steel will event. So Hawaii or Bremen or I-56, Le Havre, or Aki are your options there. Moskva at 16 kilometers. Normally a fight we don't want to be taking as a light cruiser, more than likely because we just don't have the velocity to hit him at these ranges, or just don't even have the range to hit him at these distances. And, I mean, Moskva has some very accurate, hard-hitting guns. We, however, have more HP, similar to better armor in a lot of ways, and our shell velocity is comparable. It's a little worse, but we certainly have a lot more DPM. What is this thing? Okay. And steel, okay, let's talk more about steel. I think it's interesting that this ship is also going for steel because it removes the weakness and the difficulty of playing light cruisers in that they do just explode. And we're giving it to people who have probably the most experience playing the game, right? Steel is one of the hardest types of resources to get. A lot of the time, the best way to get steel is from clan battles. And clan battles players have played the game a lot and are probably at least decently skilled at the game. And we're giving them a ship that removes the difficulty of playing a light cruiser. I don't know. A little interesting there. I just got to say, a little bit interesting there. I wonder if this will be one of the most frustrating ships to fight against going forward here. I'm not sure, but I feel like it's going to be incredibly difficult to deal with. Also, notice our shell velocity becomes a benefit throughout some of these battles. There are so many islands that you cannot arc your shells over as a light cruiser or heavy cruiser, even if you have decently poor shell velocity. This is some of the worst velocity in the game, so it allows you to push up to some very aggressive islands, and you can get very creative with how many islands you can actually arc over, because these shells are just that slow. We also need to talk about the firing angles on this ship, as that can be a bit of a killer for a lot of these very unique ships, right? There are weaknesses, surely there's a weakness. Well, 45 degrees broadside looking forward for all of our DPM, and 40 degrees backwards. That's a pretty big downside, right? That's a very broadside. Sure, we got Alaska armor, we got low in the water citadel, so good, there's a downside. Oh, but wait, we lose one turret and we still get 25-degree firing angles forward and backwards. Yeah, okay. Where's the downside again? It's absurd. It's absurd. Long range here. Longer range, not super far, but easily able to hit these destroyers. It's so nice to be able to have that Smolensk shell velocity on demand. I think a lot of people playing Colbert would gladly give up some DPM to gain shell velocity in certain situations. That's the crazy part about this, in my opinion, is that it's the flexibility to decide if you would rather have the DPM or you would rather have the shell velocity and range too. 18.3 kilometers of range. That's more than most heavy cruisers get, right? Is that more than Hindenburg? It's certainly more than Des Moines, certainly more than Zhao. That's more than Goliath. I think that's more than a lot of the heavy cruisers get in the game, as well as having similar shell velocities. Gudin here, well known to be weak to fires, and our fire per minute rate is second highest out of all the tier 10 light cruisers, only behind Jinan. And we do get better shell velocity than something like Jinan as well, at least if we're not using our F key. Lucian here, a little bit outside of our radar range, but it's still very, very easy to hit these shells. The F key, though, I would be very much struggling to land these shells, which is why I found myself a lot of the time just sticking with the normal shells. It's still very good DPM, and it's so much more consistent to get that damage in. Very important to damage those destroyers, and while I do love the high DPM, I am willing to make that trade-off to guarantee a little more consistency. Now, something I don't often praise on ships is, at least surface ships, is going to be their AA. I think Hawaii might have some of the best AA in the game as far as flak goes, as that's really all that's damaging planes effectively. Main DPS is usually not enough to deal really any meaningful damage. You need to hit those flak bursts. And this ship has 11 flak bursts with, remember, cruiser has 90% accuracy, not the 75%. like we see on battleships. So you should be getting some pretty good damage output from this ship in terms of its AA. It's still probably not going to be enough to stop a determined carrier from getting into you, especially if they're dodging those flak bursts. But if they happen to run into a few of them, you may actually survive against carriers, which is really nice to have. We could swap over to defensive fire as well instead of hydro, but I opted to take hydro here as I wanted to push a little bit more aggressively. This ship has a standard hydro loadout at 5 kilometers here. The radar being only 8.5 kilometers is certainly a downside here compared to things like Des Moines or Worcester even gets a 9-kilometer radar, so pretty close there. But this ship has so much more armor. It can afford to play at closer ranges. And that low shell velocity mode also allows us to play some really close range islands that have really tall cliffs, and we can still get over those islands. We have a standard heal here. You get 3 heals on this one, 14% HP back per heal, and standard cooldowns, as well as normal cruiser damage control party. So pretty standard stuff there. It's just that we have so much HP. 74k is more than some battleships have at this at tier 10. They're the more lightly armored cruiser, battle cruiser-esque battleships, but it is still worth mentioning. It is a ton of HP that this ship has. It's going to be very, very difficult to kill one of these things. And a lot of the time, it's just going to be playing behind islands and farming you from 18 kilometers, or at really close ranges, it'll just farm you from over some incredibly steep islands, and you won't be able to shoot back at it. I don't know where the downside is here on this one. I really don't understand what Wargaming was thinking here. I guess the idea is that it's not quite Colbert level or Smolensk level DPM, but it's still 324k HE DPM base, and I haven't even managed to run Halsey yet. I'm running him here, but we don't get Confederate buffs on test ships, so I don't actually have the opportunity to show you that level of DPM. But it should be pretty easy to get a Confed in this thing, and certainly I think this game we would have had that, considering the Kraken as well. Managed to land that one salvo, barely one shell into that final destroyer to take him out. Fun to play this ship. Will it be fun to play against, though? That seems to be a bit of a theme for Wargaming these days. I didn't talk about it as much with Bremen, but that one as well. It seems like playing these ships, high DPM, where's the trade-offs, right? I guess with Bremen, at least, you do have less HP and less armor compared to something like Hawaii. But with that ship, it's still going to be very difficult to take it down, and the DPM is going to be usable at in so many of those matches. I initially said that Bremen was probably my favorite out of all of these, and I was the one I was most excited for, as I didn't look too closely at Hawaii, I'm going to be honest with you. I was assuming that in testing they were going to nerf it down, and it wasn't actually going to be that good when it comes out, because surely there's no way they release battle cruiser armor with light cruiser DPM, right? Surely. But they ended up doing it. I think overall, Hawaii is a much more unique ship. Bremen is, let's be honest, basically just the same playstyle as Hindenburg, but a little bit more DPM, or a lot more DPM rather. This ship is just wholly unique. There is not a lot that plays like it, and if we're being honest, it plays like Smolensk, it plays like Colbert, except you have the utility of a radar, and you also just have the ability to tank battleship salvos because you're battle cruiser armor. Still pretty big hit from that Vermont, but it's still nowhere near like half our HP at once, and we can just heal back so much of that while DPMing them down. We're going to chase down a Vermont, usually an absolutely scary ship to deal with in a lot of these light cruisers, considering just one Citadel is half the HP pretty much on a Smolensk. Here, that's not the case. As well as our Citadel being below water, it's very, very unlikely that he's actually going to be able to hit it. Oh, I have one more comparison that I'd like to talk about, and that is in regards to Austin with its reload booster up, okay? How do you think Hawaii F-Key compares to Austin reload booster? Now, the HE on Austin reload booster. The SAP is obviously where the big damage is, of course, but let's go HE versus HE. Remember, this F-Key you can just always use. You only get a few seconds of reload booster on Austin, okay? And of course, the shell velocity and range is much better than F-Key Hawaii. But Austin HE DPM, when it's using its reload booster, is 688,000. Remember, our F-Key here is 571,000. So it is worse. But we just constantly have that DPM. I mean, What's the trade-off, bro? What is the trade-off here? We're just gonna instantly proc a double perma-fire on this Colombo, and then we're just gonna swap over to our AP, which, as a reminder, it's not the best in terms of pen and damage, because we do get a damage nerf when we're using the F key here. But it's still like 760,000 AP DPM when we're using that. We'll use our radar to spot this Colombo as well. It is well worth using this AP with this DPM, and we'll go flat broadside and take barely any damage to Colombo sap, right? Sure, sap hurts, but when you're dealing with a ship with sometimes 85 KHP, I guess this is arms race, you're not as worried about it compared to something like Colbert or Smolensk, which are going to get citadeled by sap. What's the weakness? Where's the downside? I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing it. Maybe I'm missing something, but this seems to be just a light cruiser that is unkillable, DPM-wise, with the range of more than heavy cruisers. And usually a bit of a downside of fast shell velocity is you can't use islands like this, but I had to include this clip at the end yet because we're within 10 kilometers here of a rather tall island. Certainly that Georgia has no shot of getting over this island to hit us, and we're just so easily able to farm over it. There's a lot of islands like this in the game close to caps, and usually they're here as a safety point, but one that is difficult to farm over, at least farm over for other ships that are closer range. Maybe super long range you can hit them. But here it's within 10 kilometers. We're still lobbing some of these islands. It is still early days, of course, with Hawaii, and perhaps I am overhyping this thing. I don't know. I still will be playing with it a lot more, but initially here, playing at some games, I don't see much for weaknesses when it comes to playing Hawaii. It has all the DPM in the world while also retaining a lot of the battlecruiser survivability. It's still not battleship level survivability, of course, but it's still very, very good. It's a lot of HP to get through. And of course, you do get this Alaska hull with more superstructure, right? This is a bigger superstructure here. It extends out the back here much more. So you can take a bit more damage there, certainly. If you go bow on, you're going to eat more just full pens into your superstructure, like we see on things like German battleships. Also, only 27 bow means more overmatch. 406s can overmatch you. We have so much HP that a couple 10k chunks, 15k chunks into your bow every 30 seconds or so isn't that big of a deal considering 74k HP here. 28 upper belt here, so can get overmatched as well by 406s, I believe. Here we have 36 mil deck armor, but again, that superstructure is big enough that this 36 mil deck armor isn't coming into play quite so much. Decent armor belt as well here, and this Citadel is waterline, below waterline, much like Alaska. Going to be very, very difficult to consistently hit that one. 18.3 kilometers of range and a lot of DPM, man. Maybe I'm repeating myself too much, but I'm a little bit shocked that this exists in its current state. I was running a bit of a Lighthouse build here towards the end, so it gets us 15 kilometers detect, but it's like 12.2 kilometers of detection if we run the full build, which is absolutely great. Very, very usable. Rudder shift time here with this build is very fun, very usable. But if I were to swap over to concealment, I had some great games this way as well. Still 13.8, which isn't too bad, and having a hydro helps us out a ton. Torp protection is really bad, but with a hydro, you know, playing on islands and that, it's really, really useful for spotting out those torpedoes. Here is this F key and what it does. 43.3% reduced reload time. Absolutely crazy. And yeah, firing over elevated terrain is easier, but it is harder to actually lead in open water, of course. But if you're good with leading Atlanta guns, then Hawaii should be no problem for you with this absurd DPM. Worst fire chance by 4% there, and I believe that's just an absolute subtracting 4% off what we already have here. So that goes from 11% down to 7%. But I think the reload is more than enough to make up for that. You're still getting a ton of fires. The AP here, it does reduce its alpha damage, of course, so that is a downside, but it's still going to do some pretty solid damage output at closer ranges. Just that pen is not as amazing, so you got to aim for upper belts, or at least finding battleships with weaker upper belts. If you run into those German or Soviet battleships, you got to hit superstructure if they go broadside. I do think the 12.5 kilometers of range isn't much of a penalty here. In fact, it might be a benefit, because remember, when you're firing, your detection goes out to your gun's maximum range, especially if we're running a concealed build where we get 12.2 kilometers of detect. That means if we're running our F key here, then we only have 12.5 kilometers of detect to deal with while firing. Sometimes that's a huge benefit on islands where there's open water on one flank, and normally you'd be detected when firing, but since you don't bloom out to 18 anymore, you bloom out to 12.5, you can stay undetected on some of those islands. You can get creative with that, and it's really, really interesting to have the weakness of slow shell velocity when you decide you're willing to deal with that weakness. It isn't a all or nothing, you load into the game in your Colbert and you just know that you have poor shell velocity. Here we can decide essentially between Atlanta velocity and near Colbert level DPM, or we can get a little worse DPM than a Smolensk while retaining its shell velocity and having 18.3 kilometers of range, all the while having Alaska armor. Giving this to the most experienced players in the game for steel is a very interesting choice for gaming. I hope that you're willing to nerf some of these ships in the future. I mean, with this steel event, we're also getting Valparaiso coming back. I don't know. Where's the downsides of some of these ships? I don't quite see them, but perhaps that is the theme going forward. Fun to play, less fun to play against, and removing weaknesses, removing things that you have to worry about when playing so that it's easier, I guess, to play it. Although, man, it makes playing some of the older ships more difficult. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I've been very excited for a lot of these new ships. I'm a little worried about the matchmaker coming up once the Steel Will event releases, though, I gotta say. Could be a rough couple of weeks. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.